quick hypothetical. Say you were like a marketing man, and it was your job to pitch a new rebrand campaign to the public. Say you're working on energy drinks. And most people, they love the old brand. They'd built a lot of trust in that brand. So whatever you do, they want something that still reminds them of the old energy drink they used to guzzle down with glee. Here's the problem. It turns out one of the key ingredients of your drink dissolves some people's lungs. Not a majority of people. In fact, it's a minor enough problem that most people don't even know that this side effect existed. But obviously, for the people affected and anyone familiar with this issue, let's say trust in the brand is low. So now you have two chunks of the population with radically different experiences with your brand, and you need to appeal to both of them. So, what do?
That maintains the status quo for the wealthy elites. Don't you think we ought to attack the roots of social problems instead of jamming people into overcrowded prisons?
Look, Lisa, it's McGriff, the crime dog. Hello, Lisa. Help me bite crime. Ruff, ruff. Ruff, 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 ruff. Ruff, 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 ruff.
So a few months back, I started writing a series about cops in movies. My goal initially was to track how the representation of police in media has changed across the last few decades, starting first with the prototype loose cannon cop Dirty Harry. Harry was an incredibly popular and highly influential character, and it was pretty fascinating looking at both him and the underlying philosophy he represented. To my mind, it wasn't exactly a coincidence that a character like Dirty Harry would see such popularity right around the time was declaring massive reforms to the war on crime, putting in place harsh and brutal policies that pretty much set the stage for the high levels of police violence and incarceration now seen in the US. After that, I took a look at later characters like Judge Dredd and RoboCop.
Stay out of trouble.
Written explicitly as mockeries of those philosophies, who nonetheless wound up distorted by Hollywood into something else entirely. Judge Dredd became an unironic, heroic figure of the establishment, and RoboCop became
the ultimate super cop. RoboCop.
What these videos wound up highlighting were that, in large part, popular portrayals of cops in media are usually the result of wider movements in society, and often serve to reinforce those ideologies, even if that means completely malforming the original intentions of those characters. Just putting out new stories that subvert these ideas isn't enough. One way or another, society finds a way. I knew I wanted to do a third entry in this series, but there wound up being a lot of different routes for me to take. Initially, it was going to be a video focused on police propaganda in kids media, but that then led to me rewatching Disney's Zootopia and getting the idea for a different video. And then the actual police started educating themselves with Disney's Zootopia. More recently, I started watching HBO's Watchmen, that has quite a lot of hot, spicy takes about law enforcement in the modern day. But there's already a bunch of great videos saying a lot of what I had to say in mind already out. So, more recently, I was streaming LA Noire.
Alright, don't shoot!
So there's this thing about LA Noire. If you haven't played it, essentially you play as a detective in the late 1940s, Cole Phelps. This very hard-nosed, no-nonsense police investigator quickly rising through the ranks of the force with his inquisitive, outside-of-the-box mindset. Cole isn't interested in lazy answers to complicated questions and just beating some minorities into an easy confession. And this is really what sets him apart from the more outdated police stereotypes he's surrounded by. Now, with all this in mind, this game was published by Rockstar Games. Yep. That Rockstar Games.
No, do you want to be my friend? Boom! Catch! Wasted, but all I ever wanted was a friend.
Just to be clear, it wasn't the same development team, nor the same engine, but for specific elements of the game, you can definitely see some of that GTA DNA. And that gives us... Whoa!
Jesus Christ!
LA Noire is a game that a lot of thought and care clearly did go into. It's surprisingly narratively complex, and each case feels like the team really wanted to give you some luscious, full-bodied mystery to wrap your head around. I liked it when it came out, I liked replaying it with my spouse a few years ago, and I like it now. But I can't deny that my favourite thing about playing LA Noire is acting out the role of a sensible, matter-of-fact investigator slowly uncovering a deep-seated conspiracy while doing this.
I don't know. Blondes, I guess.
Hallelujah! You know, this isn't a tank.
Having Phelps rifle off some scripted monologue about his personal philosophy or argue politics with his partner while barreling down the sidewalk in a truck we just stole and watching NPCs go flying over the dashboard is always great.
Let's go.
Shoving to the ground random innocent bystanders as I sprint my way over to a crime scene, only to immediately flip into Cole Phelps, observant rational detective man. The dissonance of embodying the role of this otherwise typical level-headed, trustworthy investigator, who also engages in wild acts of needless rampant brutality, never stops being funny. Until it did. Fair warning, this is where things get serious. May 25th was the last time I decided to stream myself playing some LA Noire. It was also the evening 46-year-old ex-security guard George Floyd would be brutally murdered by Minneapolis police, an act captured in heartbreaking detail by a bystander to the event. Alongside Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Alton Sterling, and thousands more, Floyd would be yet another casualty in the epidemic of police violence against the black community in the US. His crime was being accused of possessing a counterfeit $20 bill. This event would spark a series of protests across the US, with many voicing how sick and tired they were of this never-ending cycle of discrimination and brutality, particularly towards marginalized communities. I went to some of those protests, and was met with riot police, firing tear gas and rubber bullets indiscriminately into crowds of unarmed peaceful protesters. I saw mace sprayed into the faces of people doing nothing but chanting slogans arm in arm with other protesters, and gas canisters shot into medical areas, set up to help treat people who had been assaulted by the police. It turns out this was by no means the worst of it, and in the days since we've seen cop cars rammed into crowds of protesters, journalists fired at and arrested for trying to report on what's happening, and a president gleefully boasting about all of this, and his plans to further ramp up the severity of police response. Obviously, there is no real parallel between the cartoonish video game violence of LA Noire and the real-world brutality we've seen over the last few weeks. Clearly, I do not think acting like this in a video game somehow encouraged violence towards innocent bystanders. If I thought that was the case, I wouldn't have been streaming this game in the first place, considering police brutality like we've seen recently is hardly a new thing. This isn't like you play as a Nazi in a video game and now you're a Nazi. I don't think the game is even trying to encourage emulating the kind of violence seen by real-world law enforcement. While LA Noire does tackle ideas of racial discrimination and prejudice, it almost feels like you have to actively fight the game's mechanics to successfully pull off the violent acts you can pull off in the game. And even then, you get docked points at the end of each case for doing so.
Yeah, conduct, whatever. Yeah, that's... Yeah. Every case has its own...
Total tangent, but anyone who's tried to do what I do in the game is probably well aware of the weird mechanical dance you have to do to actually push and run people over, since NPCs are programmed to unnaturally jolt out of your way unless you get them in a very specific spot. The weird finesse of actually being able to do that consistently is really part of the... See, even when I tell myself all of these things about the clear difference between what I'm doing in the game and what's going on out there, I can't deny it kind of killed the joke. I know everything about the context of this and this are completely different, but seeing that in the real world, just immediately made doing it not fun anymore. The absurdity of it was gone. Despite everything, the simulation now felt too real. There's a lot of ways popular media fulfills certain desires by audiences. One obvious example is wish fulfillment, imagining yourself in this grand, important role in society, even when it's unlikely or outright impossible for you yourself to ever be in that position. This particular desire is seen a lot in movies and a lot in video games, primarily since the meat and potatoes of game design usually involves embodying a single character capable of a wide array of impossible physical feats. I know when I was a small child, there's nothing I wanted to be more than a small green crocodile who jumps real high and goes... Second to this kind of escapism is, unexpectedly, something that feels like it's appealing to the complete opposite desire within our inner psyches. Rather than experiencing power we don't get to feel in the real world, experiencing the powerlessness we'd rather not. The catharsis of experiencing pain, sorrow, and fear in an artificial setting, often seen in drama, tragedy, and most explicitly, horror. Fear of death and loss are near universal, and there is a kind of emotional release in experiencing these feelings in a controlled environment where you personally are in no real danger. In the case of media, you realise that no matter how much you feel connected with the protagonist of a work of fiction, you'll be fine. The Krampus will never get you. What does any of this have to do with police brutality? What does any of this have to do with LA Noire? And what does this have to do with the depiction of cops in media? I'll let you know right after I mention this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Have you ever wanted to learn new things in the realms of art, editing, design, and more? Gain new practical skills, or just find out where to even begin? Well, you're in luck. Skillshare is an online learning tool boasting thousands of classes in a variety of topics, with millions of members and an ever-growing library of subjects to tackle. Recently, I've been watching professional chef Eleanor Karp's series on the perfect grilled cheese. I just can't get enough grilled cheese. For whatever it is you're interested in, you can try out Skillshare today with an annual subscription of just $10 a month. You and the other first 1,000 people to click the link in the description will get 2 free months to try out the service. So give it a shot and explore your own creativity today with Skillshare.
You won't hurt me.
Oh yeah? Why not?
Because you're a policeman. There are rules for policemen.
Yeah. That's what my captain keeps telling me.
There's more to life than what you're living, so take a chance and face the wind.
So, there's something you'll find in most media depictions of law enforcement at any point in the last few decades. The wink and nod.
Is that legal?
No.
We saw this in the Dirty Harry movies, in Judge Dredd and RoboCop, and we see it in pretty much every popular media franchise starring cops. You know what I mean when I say this. Like, you know that moment where something happens that would obviously be way over the line in the real world? Like, some moment where the main character blatantly violates their code of conduct or takes part in an act of horrific violence. But then the media kind of lampshades it in that, yeah, that'd be pretty messed up in the real world, right? Way.
We got one! We got one! I got him! Yes! Slap my nuts on your motherfucking
That. There is just an endless supply of examples I could use here, but none stick out to me so well as the Kurt Russell, Sylvester Stallone banger Tango and Cash.
What is this?
English 101.
Now,
Released in 1989, Tango and Cash was actually going to be a bit of a subversion from the kind of representation I'm talking about, bucking the trend of the increasingly self-aware parody of the genre with a more dark and serious buddy cop film. Obviously, as a result of this, the original director was fired 3 months into filming, and what we ended up with is just so overflowing with cheesy, knowing references to the ridiculous direction these kinds of movies were taking.
Jesus! Jesus!
This happens in the first 2 minutes of the film. In fact, the entire plot centers around the fact that the titular duo Tango and Cash are just so wildly overboard in their rule-breaking, violence, and collateral damage that the bad guys get them out of the picture simply by setting up an obvious slam-dunk civil case against them. What follows is incitement of a prison riot, a breakout, some break-ins, brutal interrogations, more gratuitous violence, and then in the end they gun down the big bad and get welcomed back in the force with open arms and new celebrity reputations. It's this heightened, satirical mode of police representation that quickly overtook remotely grounded depictions over the last few decades. Lethal Weapon, Police Academy, Naked Gun, Beverly Hills Cop, Cop Out, Bad Boys, Bad Boys 2, Bad Boys for Life, the Fast and Furious franchise, Rush Hour franchise.
Can't you just, give us a warning or something?
That depends. You girls like Chinese?
Super Troopers, The Other Guys, The Heat, Ride Along, and about 4 different John Woo movies. In the world of self-aware spoofs of police corruption, incompetence, and trigger-happy brutality, business has been consistently booming for pretty much the last 5 decades. Movies like Starsky and Hutch and 21 Jump Street, themselves adaptations of works that were pretty out there depictions of the police for their times, deliberately dial up the absurdity and terrible police behaviour significantly, with varying degrees of critical and commercial success.
A pony!
On the flip side, you get movies like Dragnet and Chips, which take the source material and strip out any attempt at a remotely grounded depiction of law enforcement in favour of...
Ah! Oh shit! Oh shit! Oh shit! What's wrong with you? You shot your partner!
Go far enough, you even start getting stuff like John McTiernan's Last Action Hero, a story of a beloved franchise movie cop being transported into the real world. The film is essentially a parody of a parody, not just reproducing this new default of wildly exaggerated law enforcement, but taking things to a meta level, underlining how what's ultimately become the dominant form of movie cop really has less in common with actual police as it does with a cartoon.
Whiskers, where the hell have you been?
Sorry, Jack. Furball problem.
Turn on the TV nowadays, there's shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, where these wink-nod absurdities are like 1 in every 10 jokes. Or Paradise PD, where wink-nods are just every single joke. Now, to be clear, I only recently started watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and it's very cute and funny, and I like it, just as I like many of the things I've listed here. I am not condemning doing the thing where you comedically reframe a serious thing to make it more palatable and less depressing.
This man is behaving well. His reward is the canoe. This time he can sit in the canoe for up to an hour.
I am specifically condemning Paradise PD and Cop Out though, but only for being Paradise PD and Cop Out. The point would be that in the track from movies like Dirty Harry to RoboCop, Tango and Cash, and The Last Action Hero, right up to now, these overtly satirical takes on cops in media are no longer subversions. They are the standard. In the modern day, alongside waves of increased awareness around issues of police corruption, prejudice, and violence, we are inundated with these detached, cartoonish representations of law enforcement. A series of extreme caricatures, constantly reminding us that, haha, these things sure are messed up. It's a good thing this isn't real, right? It would be easy to call a lot of cop-based media wish fulfillment. After all, law enforcement has so regularly been the role of the archetypal action hero. And there's a reason they're called heroes. Enigmatic, highly proficient figures who stand out from the crowd and save the day with cunning, wit, and bravery no one else had in them. And the fact is, a lot of the time they're just cool. Bruce Willis, Will Smith, Channing Tatum, The Rock, Ice Cube, and of course, Will Ferrell. But this alone would not explain this particular trend of cop depiction in media. The knowingly incompetent, vicious, brutal, often bordering on sociopathic behaviours I've mentioned above.
You put a gun on me? You guys are cops!
So, what does that sound like to you? What does it remind you of to imagine a certain source of anxiety in society, an anxiety growing increasingly over the decades, being embodied through these caricatures, whose negative traits have been so exaggerated that while it reminds you of your concerns about their real-world equivalent, allows you to have a kind of emotional distance that helps keep the media enjoyable. Yep, the modern media cop is the unholy combination of the wish fulfillment action hero and... Horror fiction trends reflect cultural anxieties. This isn't really a new or novel observation. Increased fears around industrialization and loss of religious faith? You get Frankenstein. Rampant colonialism and the rise of social Darwinist theory? Alien takeovers. Throw in a Cold War and fears about Soviet spies?
You're here already! You're next!
The thing about trends is pretty much inevitably, they become stale, with the changing palettes of audiences signalled sometimes by offence, usually just disinterest. In a 2014 book on the evolution of modern horror movies, Alexandra Heller-Nicholas would observe the rise of brutal torture porn and found footage horror in US domestic cinema in the years directly following September the 11th. Brutal and gory horror fiction had obviously existed before the turn of the millennium, but often still less framed in such a grounded reality, and even then rarely seen as viable for a general public more interested in farce, fantasy, and parody.
Oh, look at me. I'm all dead. I'm a gross, scary, severed head.
One national tragedy later, suddenly here were mega hit franchises like Hostel and Saw, movies which were, to put it plainly, just about human beings doing horrible things to other human beings. It might not look like it, but this is catharsis. A means to process terror and anxiety that have been left to sit quietly in the back of the public consciousness, following a massive source of national trauma. While comparatively light-hearted and satirical franchises like Scary Movie and Scream would continue to exist into the 2000s, the days where those types of movies dominated the horror genre quickly died out.
Oh, also, I'm not going to get a chance to talk about this again. Was anyone else pretty fucked off as a kid that the King Kong that was in this poster wasn't actually in the movie? Yeah.
The thing is, if I were to try and draw a parallel between this and the trajectory of the cop movie into greater and greater caricature, wouldn't that just be a total contradiction? If my whole conclusion here is that as this brutality starts feeling more and more real, the appetite to see it shown in such a goofy, farcical manner dissipates, why isn't that actually the case here? Very early on in this video, I brought up incidents of rampant police violence that led to great national outcry, incidents that have only become more visible with the advent of online social media. So why is it that even to this day, cop fiction has not made this change? Why is this genre still not only dominated by the same throwaway goofball model it was 40 years ago, but if anything, has only gotten more absurd? As is hopefully obvious at this point in the video, my analogy about rebranded energy drinks was pretty transparently supposed to refer to the situation around modern day cop media. Yes, plenty of extremely high profile assaults and killings by police have taken place, bringing significant bad press for law enforcement in the US. The same goes internationally, such as the killings of Mark Duggan and Anthony Granger in the UK.
Who do you hold responsible?
The police.
Yet, as with the analogy, these are not cases that affect everyone equally, and as has become increasingly obvious, it's specific marginalised communities who almost always bear the brunt of this violence and injustice. Faith in law enforcement, especially in low-income Black and Latino communities, has obviously suffered. Not only from these highly publicised cases, but simply the everyday experience of living within over-policed districts filled with over-eager cops. A working-class Black family's experience is not the same as a middle-class suburban white family's. And that's the point. I would argue that the reason we've been in this lasting trend of cop representation, increasingly dissonant with A, the real-world trauma regularly inflicted by police, and B, those police themselves, is a result of this divide. In a recent 2018 Chicago Gallup poll, results found 35% of the residents in marginalized communities felt their area had an overall positive view of the police, with 5% being very positive. The remaining 60% had a negative view, 15% of which was very negative. For the US population in general, the total percentage of those with negative views were 19%. Over half had a highly positive view of law enforcement. The knowing wink nods to the reality of police violence and misconduct seen in modern cop media is a capitulation, an acknowledgement of the increasing public knowledge of these issues. Mostly though, this is media made to validate hegemony, the dominant ideology. Even if it wasn't the intention going into it, it is the result of what is popular. And what's popular is a depiction of the police that treats them as cartoonish, likeable, and, yes, still fundamentally heroic power fantasies. Perversely aspirational figures. How groups and movements are depicted in popular media is often a good barometer for a society's general view of them. And what we see today tells us that the public understands law enforcement has its problems, but doesn't care that much. The trauma is distant, so the fun never has to end. The simulation never gets too real. Defund the police has surprisingly become a fairly popular rallying cry in the wake of the George Floyd protests, which continue to gather crowds of many thousands in every state in the US. Again, this isn't the first time we've seen movements like this. One of the most tragic parts of the common protest chant "I can't breathe," taken from Floyd's repeated begging to the police as they suffocated him, is that it had already become a popular slogan years prior with the killing of Eric Garner. But at least from the ground, it does look like this time we're seeing something more. Groups who were previously silent to these concerns are now taking notice. The crowds are too large to ignore, and the message is resonating too clearly to try and shrug off by claiming we would listen to what they were saying, but they keep smashing windows. As you can probably guess, I would be happy to see the meaningful structural change that is being cried out for. To see more than just lip service and shallow capitulations in the face of rampant brutality and corruption. Whether we'll get to see that remains to be seen. I guess until then, I hope to see you in the protests. And I guess let's keep an eye out for how things change for the modern Hollywood cop.
You crazy guy! What did you do with my car? Welcome to America.
Look, Lisa. It's McGriff, the crime dog.
Hey, open up your eyes. You've got to see. Alcohol fills your world with lies. Listen to me. Don't be a no. It's no good when you're drinking. Show you the way. Try using your head. Hey, you'd better start thinking. You might end up dead. Being straight is okay. It seems so very nice. But you'd best be looking.
The whole damn system is clogged up with dirty money. And the news doesn't say a word about it. Because who owns them? The same corporations that own the government. Courts and the law is all we have left.